What are the problems with growth and how can we help? So growth accrues to so the big problems are growth accrues to the wealthy and increases inequality. We know this from Piketty and others. Growth is structurally required by capitalism as a stabilization mechanism against crises. And so that means that our societies are not safe in the absence of growth, and we have to deliberately growth-proof our economies. How do we do that? Heterodox economics is going to help us a lot more than neoclassical. Growth, which is seen as a proxy for social progress, actually prevents action on social and environmental protection. And I think that this is something that we really have seen in the COVID crisis, which is that if we take economic growth as underpinning social progress and health, then we'll focus on economic growth to the detriment of health and social progress. So we really need to focus on social protection directly and health directly and environmental protection directly, and not see growth as the middleman that allows us to do these things. We need to understand that the growth imperative is built into exploitative and extractive supply chains, which is provisioning systems, which are basically the unit of analysis of heterodox economics. And that's very convenient. So I want to talk about that just a bit more, because we were able to use the systems of provision method and approach, which have been developed by Ben Fine, who originated it, and Kate Bayliss, and we applied it to car dependency. And I want to talk just a bit more about that. So we basically came up, we looked at systems of provision as an analytic tool for planetary breakdown. And we looked at car dependency as created by these 5 elements of car industry, roads and parking, land use, neglect for public transport, and car culture. And just to sort of show you the kinds of things that we found, we looked at the key characteristics of the automotive industry and the implications for car dependence. So we basically were able to analyze the system that has expansion and growth built into it as a prerequisite for its own stability and profit making. And that also locks in damaging behavior and practices on the consumer side. We also looked at the main strategies of legitimation for road building, where some days they're Keynesian, some days they're growth-based, some days they're leftist, some days they're right-wing. It doesn't matter, because basically what they're doing is they're capturing the state, regardless of political parties, regardless of economic conjecture, in order to always capture public revenue for road building. And they have been very successful at this. So these are all things that we need to think about. At the end of the day, we sort of created this political anatomy, political economy anatomy of lock-in through looking at all these different sectors and all these different mechanisms, seeing how they interconnect. And I don't want to go into more detail on that, because I want to zoom into the next part, which is about understanding growth versus well-being. So we need to stop considering growth and even the magnitude of consumption as a prerequisite for human progress. And one of the real reasons we need to do this is because issues of distribution are inter- and intranationally dominant. And this is something that we were able to look at in a fair amount of detail, although others have as well in other ways, just this year in Nature Energy. So we're able to see the inequality of energy footprints within countries and internationally, and to see that the types of consumption, of energy intensive consumption that rich people consume are very different than the ones that poor households consume, and involve a lot of environmentally damaging travel. And so we're really able to analyze the fact that consumption is not equally distributed across the board, and that the things that people need to live and to live well are not the same kinds of consumption as excess consumption. And the BBC had a very nice summary of our article, Climate Change, the Rich Are to Blame, which we thought was a bit of an exaggeration, but fair enough. Then we talked about, I'm just gonna check that I'm okay for time. In terms of growth versus well-being, one of the questions we have, of course, is how much energy do we need? And one of the things we can do is we can look at the past and see that past increases in economic growth, energy, and emissions have not led to increases in life expectancy. And that's something that we can demonstrate empirically, and it's actually an elaboration of a very old result in economic demography. Then the question is, how do we understand well-being? We understand it as based, I use the theory of human needs of Doyle and Gove. We have a finite number of satiable and non-substitutable human needs. Human needs are universal across space and time, but how in this perspective, but how they can be satisfied changes. And that's quite interesting to think about, because that gives us levers for freedom. It gives us a basis of wanting the same things for everything everywhere, so everybody everywhere should have access to well-being, but the satisfiers can be different and can change. So what we did is we estimated and modeled universal well-being, the energy demand for universal well-being. This is very much based on the work of Professor Narasimha Rao of Yale. And what we did is we look at the estimates of energy services required for decent living and their efficient entire lifestyle energy footprints. I'm not going to go into detail on it. It's going to come out soon. This is a paper that's going to come out maybe like in the next few weeks. But I just want to read you our favorite paragraph, because whenever people say, oh, acting on climate change and reducing consumption means going back into caves, what we say is, with tongue firmly in cheek, the response roughly goes, yes, perhaps. But these caves have highly efficient facilities for cooking, storing food, washing clothes, low energy lighting throughout, 50 liters of clean water supplied per day per person, 15 liters heated to a comfortable bathing temperature. They maintain an air temperature around 20 degrees throughout the year, irrespective of geography. You have a computer with access to global ICT networks, linked to extensive transport networks, providing 5,000 to 15,000 kilometers of mobility per person each year via various modes, and are also served by substantially larger caves where universal health care is available, and others that provide education for everyone between 5 and 19 years old. And at the same time, it's possible the amount of people's lives that must be spent working would be substantially reduced. So when we talk about reducing consumption means going back into caves, sure, if it's a really nice modern cave connected to other nice modern caves. So the future of universal well-being satisfaction can be a very good one. And this is something that we can technically demonstrate and model. So I just want to conclude, we need the heterodox community to come on board the fight against planetary breakdown now, or yesterday would have been a lot better. Development and degrowth, I would argue, are not opposites, they are co-requisites. Degrowth has not yet engaged enough with financialization, globalization, international trade relations, including debt, all that kind of exploitative international interlinkages. And I think that this is something where heterodox economists who are used to thinking about this stuff can help a lot. And there's a huge audience for this research among social movements, progressive political parties, including around areas like the Green New Deal. So it's really crucial to engage right now. And I hope I've convinced you that you will be welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia. That was very, very interesting. So now we have our second speaker, who is Dr. Jason Hickel. So Jason is joining us just by audio, but we'll be able to share his slides if possible. Okay, so Jason, can you hear us? Jason?
He's muted, Danielle. Ingrid, can you unmute him?
Jason, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm unmuted now.
Excellent. So we have our slides.
Okay, great. Great. Yes, thanks so much for the invitation. It's really good to be here. I'm so sorry that I wasn't able to log in, so I can't use the video, but here I am. Thankfully, this works. Julia, thank you so much for an amazing presentation. If you all haven't looked into Julia's work, please do. She is utterly brilliant and is a real force in this field. Just one quick thing I just want to clear up for any people who might be confused about this. Of course, we know that it's possible to achieve absolute decoupling of GDP from emissions, some including consumption-based emissions. Some rich nations have proven this is possible. But the key question we have to focus on is that is it possible to achieve that kind of decoupling quickly enough to get emissions down to zero in time to prevent warming over 1.5 degrees? And this is a question that I've done some significant research on, and the evidence on this is very clearly it is not possible. And so in consequence, and even according to the IPCC's most recent report, high-income nations have to significantly reduce total energy use in order to make it, in order to bring the energy system back down to a size that we can actually transition it quickly enough to renewables to maintain temperatures under 1.5 or even 2 degrees, right? And the best way to do that, of course, the best way to reduce energy use is to reduce material throughput. Again, a point made by the IPCC. right? Because so much energy is required for the material throughput of our economy. And of course, this is also necessary for reducing pressure on the non-climate related planetary boundaries, right? All of which have some relationship to resource extraction. So degrowth in this sense, which is focused specifically on reducing energy and material throughput, is an ecologically coherent approach to what Julia correctly described as a multifaceted crisis, right? So just focusing on renewable energies is not enough. We have to have a more coherent approach. And the easiest way to get there is with something like a declining cap on fossil fuels and resource use. And what's nice about this proposition, this proposal, right, is that you can pose it to green growth advocates and say, look, let's agree to impose a declining cap on fossil fuels and resource use, on energy and resource use. And if GDP continues to grow, then fine, we concede you're correct. If it doesn't, then we can still manage a flourishing society in the absence of that, and that's fine. Now, what's interesting is that to date, over 50 years since this proposal has been first advanced, no green growth proponent has ever taken it up, right? Because on some deep level, I think they recognize that's not how capitalism works, that capitalism requires this kind of external frontier from which to plunder sources of value from cheap nature and cheap labor, okay? And that's what we want to address. Okay, so in this talk, I want to see if I can connect, instead of rehashing classic degrowth arguments, I want to see if I can connect degrowth to two major events that are happening in our world right now. COVID-19 and the struggle for racial justice. So first on COVID-19, right? Detractors of degrowth, including Branko Milanovic, have pointed to the COVID-19 contraction to illustrate supposedly why degrowth would be a disaster. Now, if one is familiar with the literature on degrowth, it would be impossible to draw this conclusion and make this mistake. This contraction is not degrowth. In fact, it's exactly the opposite of degrowth. And let me explain why that is in 8 short reasons, which hopefully will illustrate what we mean by degrowth. So number one, degrowth is a planned, coherent policy to reduce ecological impacts, reduce inequality, and improve human well-being. Right now, we can all agree there is no such policy. The contraction is not specifically designed to reduce ecological impacts and is not designed to improve well-being. So it's not degrowth. Number two, degrowth does not scale down the economy indiscriminately. It rather targets ecologically destructive and socially less necessary production. So the production of, say, things like SUVs, arms, beef, advertising, planned obsolescence, whatever it might be, while on the other hand, expanding socially important sectors like healthcare, education, care, and conviviality, right? So right now, a number of sectors are suffering that we actually need quite badly, such as schools, gyms, arts, public transportation, and even public healthcare is under attack by sort of backdoor privatization by the Boris government, while problem sectors are growing, such as private vehicle travel, right? So it's not degrowth from that perspective either. Number three, degrowth introduces policies to prevent mass unemployment and indeed even to improve employment, such as things like a shorter working week, a job guarantee, retraining programs to move people from dirty industries to cleaner industries, et cetera. In most cases around the world, this is not happening. On the contrary, millions of people have lost their livelihoods, and so this is not degrowth. Number four, degrowth entails policies to reduce inequality and share national income more fairly, okay? Right now, obviously, inequality is getting significantly worse because the response packages like QE and bailouts and so on have made the rich richer, specifically asset owners, and billionaires have obviously added billions to their wealth, while everybody else is losing out, right? So Andrew Sumner's recent research points out that the poorest 50% of humanity are presently losing more than $4 billion per day in income. So this is not degrowth, it's the opposite. Number five, degrowth is focused on rich countries that exceed planetary boundaries. And of course, right now we know that a number of poor countries are also suffering contraction. So again, here it's not degrowth. Number six, degrowth focuses on investment in universal public services to improve health and education and to ensure that everyone can access the goods they need to flourish without needing high private incomes to do so. And right now it's clear that in many places, the post-COVID response is going to include austerity measures. And already we're seeing governments take the opportunity to cut public spending on public goods. So not degrowth. Number seven, degrowth emphasizes the shift toward community, conviviality, commons, and care. And obviously right now we're in various stages of lockdown that prevents people from spending time together. So that's not degrowth. Number eight, finally, degrowth is part of a plan to achieve a rapid transition to renewable energy, right? And to restore soils and biodiversity and to reverse ecological breakdown. And right now governments are in contrast, in some cases, bailing out fossil fuel companies and airlines, and the UK government right now is ripping up planning regulations in order to build. So that's not degrowth. Okay. In contrast, what's happening right now is a recession, and we have different words because they're actually different things. Recessions are what happen when growth-dependent economies stop growing. It's a disaster. Degrowth calls for a different kind of economy altogether, an economy that does not require growth in the first place, and which can deliver justice and well-being without growth. Now, we can learn from degrowth, though, because degrowth scholarship provides precisely the ideas we need to accomplish a recovery from this crisis that can deliver human welfare and ecological stability without the need to rev up the engines of aggregate growth, right? So this is the answer to the politicians who believe that the response to the COVID contraction is to throw the kitchen sink at getting growth going again, right? Which is going to be an ecological disaster. Okay, so that's that. I also want to say a few things here about Black Lives Matter and global justice. So I want to start by proposing that degrowth in the North should be seen as a process of decolonization. Now, this argument has a number of facets to it. First, in the ecological sense, we know that excess economic activity in the North is actively driving ecological breakdown, which has disproportionate impacts on the South. And here I want to look at a couple of slides, which I'm going to have someone else pull up for me. So on the first slide, you'll see an image of global material footprints rising really dramatically, and also it's tightly coupled, right, to GDP. So this is a measure that includes the weight of all of the stuff that we consume as on the planet every year. If you look at slide 2, we see that overshoot is due almost entirely to overconsumption in rich countries. And the graph here on slide 2 demonstrates that, okay, so the red line there is what Guizzo considers to be a sort of safe maximum sustainable boundary for material use. What we see is that the overshoot over that boundary is almost entirely due to high income nations. And so this is, it's very clear from this data that high income nations are the major drivers, right, of ecological breakdown. If we all consumed like people, like the average person in the rest of the world, we would not be in a condition of ecological breakdown, okay? This is due to excess consumption in the North. Looking at slide 3 is simply to point out that the consequences of this excess hit the South disproportionately, okay? So high-income countries rely on a net appropriation of materials from the South, which is equivalent to 50% of their total consumption. So the ecological impacts of this consumption in the North are outsourced effectively to the South. And crucially, also appropriation occurs on unequal terms, by which I mean resources from the South are paid below the global average price for those resources. And that is, those are not naturally low prices. They're prices that have been made low through colonization, dispossession, free trade agreements, structural adjustments, et cetera, okay? Now shifting also to emissions in this next slide here, we see the same pattern playing out, right? What we have here, the graph on the left shows responsibility for emissions in excess of 350 parts per million, okay? If we consider the atmosphere to be a commons and give every person a fair share of that, what we see is that excess emissions over 350 parts per million are almost entirely produced by the North. The global North is responsible for 92% of them, the global South only 8%. And yet the South suffers 92% of the costs of climate breakdown and 98% of the deaths related to climate breakdown. So here too, we see this as a process of colonization. In the final slide, this is just 2 maps showing the contrast, right, between the extent of overshoot emissions on the top there. Green countries are still within the 350 part per million planetary boundary. And then the bottom map shows multidimensional climate vulnerability. And what we see is that precisely the nations that have emitted least, which are not responsible for climate breakdown, are the ones that are most vulnerable to its effects. Okay, so that's it for that. So I want to emphasize that this process of atmospheric colonization is not unrelated to the earlier process of colonization as such. We know that the North's industrial rise was enabled by the colonial appropriation of land, resources, and bodies from the South. And the data we now have on historical emissions reveals that the North's industrialization was also a process of atmospheric theft and continues to be. And just as the first phase of colonization wrought ecological and human destruction across the South, now so too is this dimension of it. And once we recognize this, it becomes clear that degrowth in the North represents a process of decolonization in the South, to the extent that it represents release from the pressures of atmospheric colonization and excess material extractivism. Okay. But we can also see this from the other side of the equation, right? So if we are concerned about decolonization in the South, okay, which many of us are, it requires degrowth in the North. And this is true in a very concrete sense. Right now, high-income nations, as I claimed before, maintain high levels of income and consumption through an ongoing process of net appropriation from the South on unequal terms. Right, so this is a continuation of the basic tenet of the colonial relationship, although in most cases, of course, without occupation. So what would decolonization look like in this modern sense, given this modern relationship? It would mean that high-income nations would either have to cease net appropriation, i.e. stop taking more materials and labor than they give in return, or they would have to cease unequal exchange, in other words, pay fair prices for the materials and labor they extract from the South. Now, ceasing net appropriation would likely result in a reduction of high-income nations' total consumption of materials, which would represent degrowth. Meanwhile, ceasing unequal exchange, right, would likely result in a reduction in their income, right, their surplus, and therefore a reduction in their ability to consume resources and energy to excess. Of course, high-income nations could compensate for their loss of cheap labor and resources from the South by plundering themselves, right, cutting their own forests and cutting their own wages. But we can all agree that this would be bad, and indeed would be understood as a form of internal colonization, right? So similar to the enclosure process in the 1500s. So that would violate the principle of decolonization itself. So my contention is that decolonization requires degrowth in the North. Now, but here's the question that people often want to ask. If you have degrowth in the North, won't the South suffer as a result? After all, much of the South depends for its income on exporting products to satisfy consumer demand in the North, right? Raw materials, sweatshop produced goods, and so on. To me, this argument is problematic in as much as it echoes arguments that were regularly made under colonialism itself, namely that extraction and exploitation are ultimately good for the colonized, right, because of the civilizing mission and all that. Today, the discourse shifts only subtly, such that extraction and exploitation are cast as good for development, okay? So high-income nations should keep over-consuming, but because it is for the good of the poor, which is remarkable. Forgetting for a moment, of course, the fact that climate change and ecological breakdown are actually harming the poor. So to me, this is a wild argument. But it's peddled regularly. Take Nick Kristof, for example, who a few years ago wrote an article in the New York Times titled 3 Cheers for Sweatshops, where he argues that sweatshops are the best way to get people out of poverty, so we need more of them. We should not boycott sweatshop brands, but rather buy more sweatshop stuff. Now, this gets it completely backwards. The way to reduce poverty isn't exploitation, but rather justice. People in the South should receive fair wages for their labor and fair prices for their resources. Doing this would, of course, cut access to cheap labor and cheap nature, and would ultimately have a degrowth effect in the North. And that's okay, right? Which is the main argument we make in degrowth. Now, a reduction of demand in the North also creates space for Southern economies to shift away from their role as exporters of cheap labor and raw materials, and to focus instead on developmentalist reforms and building economies that are focused on sovereignty and self-sufficiency. So using land reforms, nationalization, tariffs and subsidies, investments in public goods, etc. In other words, the things they were doing during the 60s and 70s before neoliberal structural adjustment reversed it all, right? So as David Harvey has argued, structural adjustment had to dismantle developmentalist reforms across the South in order to create new frontiers for growth in the North. In a degrowth scenario, the pressure for this fix is ameliorated, and it becomes easier to pursue developmentalist principles, assuming, of course, that there's political will nationally, without worrying about Western intervention, decolonization, right? As a final point, I want to connect with the argument that's been made in the past few years by scholars including Silvia Federici, Jason Moore, and Raj Patel, okay? They argue that capitalism requires the cheapification, or the cheapening, I like cheapification better, of labor and nature in order to generate GDP growth. In order to do this, early capitalists in the 1500s had to construct nature as a category fundamentally separate from human society, an idea that reached its zenith in the form of Cartesian dualism, which remains fully with us today. By hiving off the category nature, you can make it external to human affairs, and therefore it can be cheapened. Okay, literally, we consider damage to be, externalized. I have 1 minute left, and I'm going to finish shortly. Okay, so things that were once considered to be living beings become an object, a thing, a kind of static stand of resources which we can extract and exploit from. Now, once you have this category of nature, then by putting certain human beings in it, you can make them cheap too. So women were cast as closer to nature so they could remain unpaid. Africans were classed as closer to nature in the discourse of the time called savages. Indigenous peoples were cast as literally animals, not human beings at all. So like nature, these people were cast as objects, and you could do whatever you wanted to them, including genocide and enslavement, for the sake of capitalist surplus extraction. So the racism that continues, I propose to you, the racism that continues to viper through our culture today is an artifact of this growthist political economy. It is still deployed today to justify inequalities and wage disparities. So I propose that degrowth helps us dissolve these dualisms. Without the pressure for constant growth, the pressure for cheap nature and cheap labor begins to disappear. And along with it, the violence with which the system must police the boundaries between nature and society. Or let me put it this way, in a final sentence. It is irrational to expect that a system predicated on the cheapening of nature and labor will ever automatically solve the crisis of ecological breakdown and stop being racist. But once we rid ourselves of the pressure of growthism, and therefore of the pressure for cheapness, we might have a fighting chance. So that's my take. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jason. That was a very interesting presentation. So now our third speaker is Dr. Chantal Naidoo. Chantal, are you able to share your slides, please?
Can you see that, Danielle? You can?
Yes, it's all good if you could do full screen.
Yeah, going there now. Does that work?
Yes, that's perfect, thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, everyone. And thank you especially to Danielle for the invitation to contribute to this conference, and to everyone that's on the line for making time to listen. I wanted to maybe just put some context to my presentation, and in light of Julia and Jason's positioning. So my presentation comes more from the perspective of a combination of what I'm seeing in practice in my work as in South Africa on energy transitions and greening of finance. And that's off the back of a mostly policy related type experience. But I've also recently finished my PhD at the University of Sussex. And my supervisor was actually Professor Tim Foxon, who is well schooled in ecological economics, and I benefited a lot from his insights and helping me to better understand this frame. My own background is more hardcore finance, which is a subset of the economic studies, but I was schooled very much in finance is about algebraic formulae, it's about number crunching, and there was no social dimensions at all mentioned in any of our classes or conversations. In fact, one course at the University of Sussex on the political economy of finance had me in tears, literally, having felt that the education system that I'd grown up in had effectively lied to me to understand how so political and tense that the way finance has actually evolved in responding. So I come from, the presentation takes a little bit of a different take, and I'm going to use an inspiration from 1837, Hans Andersen, who crafted this ingenious tale about the emperor who had an obsession with beautiful clothes, two weavers professing to make clothes that only the wise can see, a very intelligent prime minister and loyal public who remained very silent because they did not want to be deemed unwise in the eyes of the emperor, and a young boy who called out the truth that the emperor was in fact not wearing anything at all. This tale endures today, and I'm sure you've heard the expression, the emperor's new clothes, the emperor's clothes attached to various things, and I've seen it even in academia and blogs in the last few years. I would like to use it to just share some of my reflections. And in the context of COVID, which is the world we're in now, I have classed COVID-19 as the child in my story, who called out to all of the others listening, but he's not wearing anything. And why do I say so? I believe COVID-19 has revealed the unique vulnerability of every country on this planet. Most of what it has shown us is not new. I think you've seen some of what Jason is saying, what Julia has been saying as well, and other academics that have been blogging and highlighting the fight for sustainability, but also what COVID shows us. We've been living very quietly with a very, and I say quietly in square brackets, but with an unjust and inequitable world, even though we know that efforts have been made, but the timeliness and the depth of our actions, one might say they have been muted, not to distract from the good efforts of people that have been trying. So I want you to hold some thoughts in your mind as I go through my slides, which are not too many. Who is the emperor, the prime minister, the weavers, and the adults in this story? So let me take you through my journey. Let's see. Okay. So I started I came to my PhD specifically from a finance perspective, and that was based on working with policymakers on climate finance and how do they engage in the climate response and the climate breakdown. And these 4 points are the points I'd like to make about what my experience was, that policymakers are largely interpreting the role of the financial system as only securing more finance for the projects. And at the moment, this is also linked to, how do you support the recovery? What kind of instruments do we need? What kind of green recovery strategies do we need? And all of it, to just pick up Jason's point, all of it is underpinned on a certain idea of growth, and it just needs to be green growth. And Julia actually made this specific point in her opening slides as well, that green growth will not work, just that narrative will not work, which I wholeheartedly support. The other thing I've noticed in how policies are unfolding is financiers appearing to drive these solutions rather than the underlying fundamental need of a situation driving finance. Sorry for the typo. And the responses and the policies at the back of my mind have always worried me from what I'm seeing in practice. They always seem to be very shallow. They seem to be based on a certain assumption sitting at the back of someone's mind relative to what is required. And that in itself is a normative view, of course. But inherently there seems to be a deep risk of creating unsustainable, sustainable pathways because they fundamentally built on the same assumptions that created the unsustainable pathway in the first place. And I think Julia and Jason's slides attest to those. So the questions that have bugged me a lot is how will this financial system that we have create and sustain these new pathways? And how would we know that that is actually the case, that they actually are doing so? How do I frame the financial system? This is just a broad illustration. I won't go through the detail, but broadly that there's private and public intermediaries, and within those broad categories, there are different types of institutions. So commercial banks, investment banks, and other lending agencies. On the public side, it's your national budgets and other market type mechanisms, multilateral, bilateral type banks, IMF, and some of these are becoming, especially on the public intermediary side for developing countries, are becoming very prominent because the safety net in dealing with COVID-19 is very fragile in developing countries. So the IMF and World Bank and other multilateral development banks are ending up being those of last resort. And hold on to that thought for a moment. And then of course, regulators and others. So just so that you know how I'm framing financial system when I speak of it in the next few slides. What I saw happening in practice in the financial system, specifically on sustainability crisis, is that we have over 115 sustainable finance type initiatives and about 390 sustainable finance measures. And these have been tracked by the finance measures to the graph on the right have been tracked by UNEP, but their data actually goes back much earlier, up to 1980, around about the time that the Brundtland Commission came into play. and encourage multilateral banks to develop new approaches to environmental and social risks in their projects and programs. The 115 sustainable finance initiatives, just really, especially post-Paris, grew exponentially. There's a lot of interest in how different types of components of the financial system, by the slide I showed earlier, contributes to the sustainable transition and the new pathway of low emission and high resilience. But what I'm also observing is, the narrative that exists in the financial system, which is largely risk-based. And you would have seen and read of work, both in practice and academically, around transition and physical risks. And this is very valid work, the work specifically on central banks, for example, by people like Irene Monasterello and Emmanuel Campiglio, Stefan Battiston and others. Very valuable insight in terms of how central banks, per their mandate, are framing, the response. But inherently, it's primarily a risk-based approach. If this happens, then what are we going to do? Which I find personally very limiting, because what we are dealing with, we know it's going to happen. There's a high degree of certainty that the climate's changing. Julia's slides specifically point out some harrowing numbers to show us about those planetary boundaries being breached. So holding that on the one side is sustainability crisis. We've got COVID-19 that's entered into the fray quite unexpectedly, when we thought we had the luxury of the small window that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told us we had, another 8 years to get our act into gear and do something. But COVID-19 really changed a lot. And what it's bringing into the financial system space is these very strong narratives about a green or a clean, I'm mixing those two words together, sorry. A green and a clean recovery, and a focus on international finance and central banks and how that works out. And what I always, I worked in the financial system myself as a banker, and it always amuses me how the bond market is used as the elixir for all ills. So there's also, predictably, we've had climate bonds, we've had green bonds, we have transition bonds, and now we actually have COVID bonds as to say this is what we can do to fix this problem. But what did COVID-19 reveal as the child calling out into the universe? As I said earlier, the vulnerability of each country and the consequence of past policy decisions as well. From the work I've seen and the policymakers I've spoken to, both in South Africa and largely over the rest of Africa, it's also shown the extent of our ill-preparedness for crisis situations, as well as the inflexibility of our economic and social and financial systems. What that is playing up is some very deadly trade-offs between saving lives, saving livelihoods, locking in a recovery plan that is about industrialization, it's about growth, it's about fixing things, getting jobs, and at the expense of what does this mean for the climate? What does it mean for sustainability? What does it mean for social justice issues and all of those dimensions? So that expediency, that urgency to act is actually throwing up what Gramsci called, quite morbid symptoms and potentially morbid decisions as well. I think Jason might have alluded to this point as well around the conditionalities that might be, feeding into some of the loans and financings that are happening. And there are some, what I call sacred preconditions that are starting to be linked to the financial response. That you have to grow in a certain way, and you have to do certain things in your countries. While this might work for some developed countries, and I would argue not all of them, it's very hard for developing countries to step back and say, well, we can't take those conditions. So they end up taking on burdens that they can't bear. But on the other hand, I'm also seeing some really interesting innovations and ingenuity, which is existing in unexpected places. So the Senegalese, for example, with their very cheap COVID testing kits, they've been able to produce this and roll that out. Places like Madagascar, places like pooled procurement for medical supplies across the region in Africa. So some really unexpected ingenuity, which is also changing the way cooperation happens across countries. So my journey carried on in terms of looking at academic linkages, and I won't go through the detail of this slide too much, but as you can see on the right, there are so many framings of how, you know, sustainability related finances unfolded in the literature. The earliest data I could come up with was 1988, 11 different framings. So you would think, you know, common sense might say that we've got all of this framing in our finance and our academic literature, and a lot of this is also practice. Why then are we battling on climate, the climate breakdown? Why are we battling in terms of a COVID response? And to be honest with you, that also baffles me. But all of these narratives are not in a coherent framing. And that's what some of my research has shown me, that the orthodox approach, which is dominant, and what I would call emergent approaches like ecological economics and donut economics, framings like mission-oriented finance, they're not yet mainstreamed into the orthodox, and the orthodox is still dominant, including the tools and widgets of that orthodoxy, which is embedded in the norms and practices of the institutions that have to make change. And one other point, which is not on the slide, but a point that really troubled me when I went back and dug into the 1987 Brundtland Commission report, was how an expectation was put in place between what public and private capital do and have to do with each other in response to sustainability issues. And there's actually a phrase that says, public finance is expected to compensate private finance for the additional risk it assumes in addressing environmental, social, and governance factors. And this is, this is the birth of the sustainable development movement. That expectation was set in place and is embedded everything that's flowed from it. My learning then in this background was to invert perspectives, but it took me a long time to get to this place. Coming from a hardcore finance type background, my default zone was always to look at these issues and policy challenges from the perspective of the financier. But the perspective changes very significantly if you turn it around to what is the need of the situation, what is the characteristics of that need, and what demands would that characteristics actually place on this financial system. I was inspired by Carlota Perez's work and Mary O'Sullivan's work, where they made a very simple but profound point for me, which was the characteristics of the innovation process should inform the demand for finance. It's akin to, this financial system is like a tail wagging the dog. It shouldn't be that way, but sadly it is.
Chantal, you just...
I'm running out of time?
Yes, 1 minute, please.
Okay. I will skip the next few slides, but I can make these available through Danielle Ingrid. But maybe jump to my last slide. So what does all of this matter for research and policy making in a transformed world? The title of our conference. I might argue, Danielle, that we're not transformed yet, but we're definitely a world that's shaken. And I feel as researchers and researchers that are also trying to engage in a policy space, it's useful to identify what the sacred laws are that are staying unchallenged, which is the emperor for me in the story. And also, a lot of the solutions that are being considered, we need to interrogate those assumptions. What clothes are we dressing up this problem with? What does it look like? And better to understand why and how some of these issues are guarded and why they're guarded in the way that they are. And in that emperor's clothes story, the weavers are demonized very much so, for sure. But they were two clever chaps. I think they understood the need to play with the options, to be flexible, how to think deep and fast, and they knew what the incentives were that was driving, upholding that system. And that's something we need to deeply engage with. What is the incentives holding up the system? Also, the work of Andy Sterling at SPRU at the University of Sussex, I would highly recommend, including Sheila Jasanoff. And both of them speak about, in terms of policy, how to hold the complexity, engage with it, because often the oversimplification of the problem set is reductionist, and it narrows out the policy scope that may be there. So perhaps on that note, I will end, but will say to you that the answer to the question on the weavers, who's the weavers, the emperors, the clothes, the child, not so much the child, but the Prime Minister, is probably all of us, certainly all of me. I have all of those in me at different points in time when I think about how do I contribute as an academic into a policy space and using academia as a tool to drive change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chantal. That was an excellent presentation, very interesting. So we are just getting close to 3 o'clock. So can I suggest we go 10 minutes beyond schedule? And so then we have some time for questions and answers. And apparently we have about 20 questions from the audience. So if I could ask the 3 presenters to join, and I'll bring some questions to the table for you to answer. So there are a few questions that were voted as well by the attendees. So I'll start with the first question. Thank you for a great presentation. It would be interesting to hear how we achieve poverty reduction by decentering consumption, given that even the measurement of poverty, particularly extreme poverty, depends on consumption. Furthermore, it appears the issue is not growth per se, but massive inequality and the present mode of development. Why would that not be compatible with growth? If growth was more actable, it is necessarily incompatible with preventing environmental collapse.
I can respond to that briefly, and then maybe Julie has something else to say. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, so about poverty, yeah, I mean, certainly, you know, the point here is actually to increase the consumption of the poor, because they effectively underconsume energy and resources necessary for human well-being. And this is something that we see in Julia's work as well. So, but what is interesting about what you say about the poverty measure? The poverty measure actually is not just income. It's also access to things like gifts and commons and subsistence goods and so on, right? And that actually is interesting, because this is something that the degrowth scholarship emphasizes, is that income should not be the sole determinant of one's access to resources. Okay, so the more we can expand commons, and the more that we can expand public goods, right, the more welfare purchasing power our income has. So, for example, if you are trying to live on $30,000, if your family is living on $30,000 a year in the USA, then you will not be able to send your children to university, and you will not be able to afford healthcare. You'll be very sick and miserable. If you're living on the same income in purchasing power terms in Finland, then you have access to free education and free healthcare, and you're in a much better position, because the welfare purchasing power of your income is much higher. And so that's effectively what we want to do, is we want to expand the welfare purchasing power of incomes, right? So that's interesting. Your point about inequality, yes, I mean, we need to reduce inequality massively, and in fact, inequality represents an opportunity. In states that have high levels of inequality, then you can improve human well-being without any additional growth, simply by redistributing existing income more fairly. Okay, so there's no reason that the USA has a per capita income of $60,000. Okay, Portugal's per capita income is 65% less than that, and yet they have higher human development indicators across the board. Right? Why? Because they invest in universal public goods and fairer wages. Okay, so the U.S. could conceivably significantly improve its human development outcomes, while at the same time scaling down GDP per capita. I mean, theoretically, in terms of modeling, one could presuppose this. So you're right, inequality is a problem, but inclusive growth, i.e., growth that benefits everybody equally, still becomes an ecological problem. Right? That's why ultimately, you know, growth beyond planetary boundaries is something that is A, not necessary, but B, ecologically destructive, and that's the real sticking point. Yeah.
So I can add some things. Actually, we're doing very detailed studies that unfortunately are not published yet, but I'm happy to share 2 draft papers where we looked at the household footprints, energy footprints in Zambia, Vietnam, and Nepal. And one of the interesting things we see is that poorer households actually consume more energy than richer households, because they don't have access to efficient infrastructure. So this idea that more is better is really wrong. And I think we have to really have our understanding be more sophisticated. we can, if we have public investment of the kind that Jason is talking about, I think we can allow people to consume less, but have more of the services. So what we really want are energy and resource services, and we can have more of these high quality services that do not put people's health in danger, for instance, through indoor air pollution. So I think that that's a really important distinction to maintain. In terms of equality and inequality and growth, I would say that the reason that growth leads to inequality is not optional. Thomas Piketty has shown this. This is what growth does. It accrues wealth to the wealthy. That is what our economies do. They are machines to extract resources and to exploit workers and deliver wealth to the wealthy. That's what they do. And unless we counteract that massively through public mobilization, public programs, that is the normal trend of a capitalist economy. And that's something we really have to be
Okay, thank you. Shall we go to a second question then? So we have a second question on what is the degrowth economists' answer to the counter-argument that we need growth to finance the social state, education, health, etc.? More taxes, but what if, even if tax rates are larger and more progressive, the income tax base decreases?
Yeah, I can jump in really briefly, and then I'm sure Julia will have more to say. Yeah, so the amount of money necessary for robust universal public goods is actually not very much. Costa Rica has an extraordinary universal welfare system with healthcare and education that is the best in the global south. And their GDP per capita is 80% less than the USA, right? They have better health outcomes than America does, than the USA does. Spain has extraordinarily high life expectancy, okay, one of the highest in the world. Their spending on their public health system is about $2.9 thousand per person per year, right? That is about a quarter of what the USA spends to get worse health outcomes, right? So yes, of course you need national income, and you need a tax base and investment in public goods, but it does not need to be high. And this is the key point we want to emphasize in the degrowth scholarship, is that high levels of GDP are not necessary for high levels of well-being, and that's demonstrated in the empirical record over and over again. So it's in a country like the USA, the simple answer is that you need significantly higher tax rates on top incomes. Right now, they're taxed lower than the poor, which is madness. I think we can all agree.
I agree with what Jason had to say. I'd just like to add that there's a lot of scholarship in the degrowth community or the post-growth community on specifically this question. There's a really nice book on well-being and post-growth by my colleague Milena Bux and Max Koch. I also wanted to know if Chantal had anything to add here. I think would be quite interesting.
Oh, sorry, Julia. From my side, no, not so much to add, other than because I guess I don't come from the world of deep economics as both you and Jason. But what I see is it's like I'm mainly from the finance side and the policymaker side, and all I can tell you is, and it's probably in response to Carlos Gomez's question a little bit about the ethos of the financial system itself, it is entirely driven by a growth dynamic, a growth perspective. Every solution for COVID, every solution for sustainability, response to climate change as well, all of it is underpinned by that is the sacred assumption that you cannot mess with. And to me, that's fundamentally wrong, because everything else becomes discarded. So the issue of degrowth is not even in policymakers' conversations. It's not part of their toolkit. The kind of dynamic that Jason was showing about a resource-intensive Northern Hemisphere and much less so on the Southern Hemisphere, I think that would shock some policymakers if they fully appreciated it. But I don't know what courage they have in actually taking this on as a policy agenda and actually making it real, and how they feed that into their narrative. because there's so much in this system that's complicit to uphold the sacred assumption of growth.
Okay, thank you all. I'm very conscious we ran out of time, and we have excellent questions that came up, more than 20 questions. So I'm going to suggest that we wrap up this session. And what I could do is I'll collect the questions, I'll pass them to the panelists, and we maybe can open a topic on the online forum for the discussion to carry on, and for the participants to also be able to engage and raise comments and more discussions. So we have our next session is at 3:30, so it starts in 20 minutes, roughly, 3:30 BST time. And that's on Heterodox perspectives on COVID-19. So if you'd like to participate and to register, you can just go on AHE's website and book your ticket. This is going to be open until the session starts. So let me thank you once again, the three speakers, Julia, Jason, and Chantal. Thank you very much for wonderful presentations.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all. Good to meet you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck for the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And thank you to the attendees as well, who I hope you enjoyed the session. And please stick on, because we still have many very interesting sessions throughout the month, Thursdays and Fridays. So thank you very much, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.